In our previous film, Reformation, the dissolution of the empire, we told the story of a series of wars and rebellions that swept across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, known as the Reformation. It led to the division of the Russia-Horde Empire and the emergence of numerous new independent states on its territory. The collapse of the empire left a significant impact on world history. However, many events of those years were misinterpreted by historians of the Scaligerian school. They were educated with an incorrect version of history and chronology, which led them to alter many historical facts to the point of being unrecognizable. In this film, we will explore three such events from European history in the 16th to 18th centuries: the defeat of the Cathars in Western Europe, and the wars of the Romanovs against Stepan Razin and Yemelyan Pugachev in Russia. It turns out that these tragic events were also consequences of the so-called Reformation. This is Languedoc-Roussillon, a region in southern France. This area is famous for the ruins of many ancient Cathar fortresses. In the Middle Ages, powerful castle fortresses were built on the mountaintops here, controlling trade routes and military roads. The names of these castles are well known through novels and films, such as
Montségur, Perpetusa, Quiribius, Piuver, Roquefixade, Termès, Carcassonne,
and many others. These fortresses, occupying dominant heights, housed military garrisons. However, only a very wealthy and powerful states could construct such a grand system of fortifications. As it is known, medieval France was not such a state. So, who built these castles? And why is Languedoc still referred to as the land of the Cathars? Who were the Cathars? A number of legends are associated with the Cathars movement, reflected in European art and folklore. Starting from the Age of Enlightenment to the present day, Catharism is considered by most researchers as the most serious adversary of the Roman Catholic Church prior to the onset of the Reformation, greatly influencing religious processes from the 14th to the 16th centuries. Traditional history claims that a new Christian doctrine, whose supporters were called Cathars, emerged in Western Europe in the 10th to 11th centuries. The positions of the Cathar adherents were particularly strong in the region of Albi in southern France, which is why they were sometimes referred to as Albigensians. Historians believe that the religion of the Cathars was greatly influenced by the Bulgarian Bogomil sect. As encyclopedias report, the 11th century Bulgarian Bogomilism and Catharism, known in the West from the 12th to the 14th centuries, are considered to be the same religion. It is believed that the Cathar heresy, arriving from the East, developed in Bulgaria, and the name Bulgarians was preserved as a term used to describe its origin. Religious historians and priests believe that both Bogomilism and the Cathar doctrine contained serious contradictions to Christian dogma. For example, they were accused of allegedly rejecting the recognition of sacrament and the central dogma of Christianity, the Holy Trinity. Based on this, the Catholic Church declared the Cathar doctrine heretical. The opposition to Catharism was for a long time one of the main motives in the policies of the Roman popes. Despite the Catholic Church's long struggle against the Cathars, a large number of Catholics were among their numerous supporters. They were attracted to both the daily and religious way of life of the Cathars. Moreover, many Catholic believers belonged to both churches, the Catholic Church and the Cathar Church. And in the regions where Catharism had a significant influence, there were never any religious conflicts. Historians claim that the confrontation between the Cathars and the Catholic Church reached its peak allegedly in the early 13th century. In order to combat the heretics, Pope Innocent III established the Church Inquisition and later sanctioned a crusade against the Cathar territories. The papal legate Arnaud Amaury was in charge of leading the crusade. However, the local population of the Cathar regions supported their legitimate rulers and actively resisted the Crusaders. This resistance led to a 20-year war that devastated the south of France. Subsequently, historians wrote that these battles were too numerous to be listed. The Cathars defended themselves particularly fiercely in Toulouse and Carcassonne. The intensity of these battles can be judged by a fact that has reached us from the depths of time. The Crusaders turned to Arnaud Amaury with a question of how to distinguish a heretic from a faithful Catholic. To which the abbot replied, "Kill them all, for the Lord knows who are his." In this war, the Cathars and their supporters, including Catholic feudal lords, suffered defeat, and the subsequent systematic repressions culminated in the complete destruction of the movement. In the end, the Cathars vanished from the historical stage of the Middle Ages, and their majestic castle fortresses were demolished by the victors. Thus, according to the traditional historical version, the confrontation between the secular and ecclesiastical authorities of France and the Cathars took place in the 13th century. During the same era, the castles of the defeated were destroyed. However, there is ample evidence that as late as the 17th century, Cathar castles existed, not as forgotten relics, but as active military fortresses. Historians have their explanation for this. They claim that after the barbaric destruction, French authorities restored the Cathar castles and turned them into their own military strongholds. As such, the castles remained until the beginning of the 17th century, and then they were destroyed once again. Theoretically, such a scenario might be possible. Destroyed, restored, destroyed again, and restored again. However, both the restoration and the destruction of such gigantic structures are highly costly endeavors. But in this strange version proposed by historians, it is not only the unusual fate of these fortresses that is surprising, but also the fact that all these transformations occurred exclusively with Cathar castles. For example, let's consider what historians say about the fate of the Cathar castle of Roquefixade. It turns out that in the 14th to 15th centuries, after the defeat of the Cathars, it served as an active royal fortress. And, obviously, a royal garrison would serve in well-equipped fortifications, not in grey ruins. However, the further account resembles a bad joke. Supposedly, in 1632, King Louis XIII, while traveling from Paris to Toulouse, passed by this castle. He stopped and pondered for a while. And then, allegedly, he ordered the complete destruction of the castle because it was no longer useful, and it had become too expensive to maintain. However, if it was truly beyond the royal treasury's means to keep the castle in a state of military readiness, it would have been logical to simply withdraw the garrison, lock up the barracks, and leave the castle to decay under the influence of time and weather. For example, that's how the castle of Perpetuus quietly and naturally, according to the traditional history, fell into ruins. Most likely, this semi-fantastical story was invented by Scaligerian historians after 1632, to somehow explain the true reasons for the castle's destruction during the wars of the first half of the 17th century. They couldn't admit that the Crusades against the Cathars took place in the 16th and 17th centuries. After all, these events had already been placed in the 13th century by historians, so they had to concoct a ridiculous fable about a strange royal decree. But if historians came up with such a ridiculous explanation for the ruins of Roquefixade, they didn't bother inventing anything about the castle of Montségur. It is known that it served as an active royal fortress until the 16th century, and then it was supposedly simply abandoned. But if the king didn't give the order to destroy it, why did the castle end up in such a deplorable state? Today, it is just a pile of rubble. Only the outer belt of walls survived. It is inconceivable that such a structure could have collapsed on its own. Even today, it is evident how sturdy it was. Huge stone blocks, neatly fitted together and firmly cemented. The massive walls and towers form a solid stone cement monolith. Such walls don't collapse by themselves. To destroy them, one needs gunpowder and cannons. But why would they expend so much effort and resources to demolish these formidable fortifications, even if they had lost their strategic value? Historians cannot answer this question. As we have already mentioned, secular and Christian historians believe that the Cathar doctrine is closely connected to the ideas of the Bulgarian religious sect of Bogomils. Just like Catharism, the Christian Church considers the teachings of the Bogomils as heresy. It is known that the religious movement of the Bogomils came to Bulgaria from the east. But who were these people, and where exactly did they come from? In the history of Paul the Deacon and in the chronicles of the dukes and princes of Benevento, there is information that these people were Bulgars who came from the part of Asian Sarmatia irrigated by the Volga. This means that the Bogomils came from the Volga, which is why they were called Bulgars, that is, Bulgars, Bulgarians or Bulgarians, and their settlement territory became known as Bulgaria.
Historians themselves say that in the 13th century, the territory in modern Bulgaria was populated by people originating from the Volga. This aligns well with our reconstruction. In our reconstruction, the Great or Mongol conquest began in the 13th century. It emerged from the Russia horde, where the mighty Volga River flows. The conquest engulfed not only Bulgaria but also Western European countries such as Germany, Italy, and France. Thus, Bulgars, also known as Cathars, appeared in Western Europe. Even today, in northern France, Cathars are called Bulgars. In Italy and other regions, they are sometimes referred to as Bugars.
Indeed, on maps compiled by modern historians, the spread of Cathars' Bogomils is shown exactly in these regions: Spain, France, Germany, England, Greece, Turkey, and the Balkans.
The Cathars arrived in Western Europe at the forefront of the Great Conquest in the 14th century. They remained there until the 17th century, until the victory of the Reformation Rebellion. After the triumph of the Reformation Rebellion, Western European rebels began a fierce struggle against Russia horde and the remnants of the Russian descendants, including the Cathars. According to our reconstruction, some of the crusades that supposedly took place in the 13th century were directed against the Cathars in Western Europe. The Albigensian Crusade and others were actually campaigns of the 17th century that ultimately led to the defeat and destruction of the Cathars.
This version proposed by the authors of the new chronology provides an answer to the question we posed at the beginning of our film. Who built more than 100 castles known as Cathar castles? It is quite obvious that a small nation-state would not have been capable of constructing such a powerful network of military fortifications. Moreover, these fortresses could not have been built and, most importantly, maintained by minor princes and barons. Only a very strong and wealthy state could have afforded to do so.
The Cathar castles were strategic points of the Russia horde empire on the conquered and colonized territories of Western Europe. It was a grand chain of fortifications that controlled all movements across Western Europe, including movements along rivers and roads. During the Reformation Rebellion, all these castles were seized and destroyed by the rebels. By studying the documents that have survived to this day, we have discovered that these castles, the Cathar castles, remained intact and undamaged until the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century. They were only destroyed starting from the second half of the 17th century. Although historians today claim that these castles were supposedly destroyed long ago in the 13th-14th centuries.
Obviously, a complete picture of those events could have been reconstructed from texts written by the inhabitants of the castles themselves. However, after their destruction, very few written documents remained. Historians suggest that Cathar writings were quite numerous, but the severe persecution led to the disappearance of most texts because the Catholic Church subjected Catharism to the most terrifying repressions. After all, for the rebellious reformers, not only the living bearers of the idea of the great empire, the Cathars, were dangerous, but also any material evidence of the lives of these people, their true purpose, and faith. In the modern world, attitudes toward the Cathars are mixed. On the one hand, in southern France, the dramatic and captivating story of the unsubdued Cathars is widely promoted. Cathar cities and castles, stories of the Inquisition stakes, attract the attention of tourists. On the other hand, it is constantly emphasized that Catharism is a highly harmful heresy and that it existed here so long ago that there is no trace of it left. However, images of Cathar Christian symbols still survive in some Gothic cathedrals in France.
готических соборах Франции.
This is what a Cathar cross looks like, inscribed within a circle. Similar crosses can be seen in the famous Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris. Moreover, Cathar crosses are present here in two forms: flat and relief convex. They are depicted on stone sculptures, mosaics, stained glass windows, and main columns inside the church. Even above the main entrance of the cathedral, on the central portal depicting the Last Judgment, there is a sculptural image of Christ. Behind his head, on the wall, there is a stone Cathar cross. Let's compare this image with Orthodox icons, where a halo is usually depicted behind Christ's head, and in the background of the halo, there is a cross. As we can see, these images are practically identical. Therefore, there is nothing heretical about the Cathar cross. So why has the Christian Church been claiming for several centuries that Cathar faith is heresy and that Cathar symbols are heretical? And why do these symbols still proudly adorn not some provincial church but the colonnade of one of the most important churches not only in Paris but in all of France? Today it is believed that the construction of the cathedral began in the 13th century. Historians emphasize that it was built during the era of the struggle against the Cathars. But if they were fighting against them, why did the Church allow the walls of its cathedral to be adorned with crosses of its enemies, the heretical Cathars? The authors of the New Chronology believe that there is nothing surprising about this.
According to our reconstruction, Catharism or Bogomilism was not heresy but rather a thoroughly orthodox Christianity of that time. However, after the victory of the Reformation rebellion, as often happens, the victors declared the defeated as heretics. Today, in textbooks, Cathars or Bogomils are presented as heretics who needed to be eradicated. This is all done on paper. It is purely a paper-based political and ideological activity of the 17th century. In reality, things were not like that. It was the Orthodox Christianity of its time, and its symbolism was orthodox, as can be seen even today from the remnants of Cathar crosses.
This is the city of Toulouse, the Paul Dupuy Museum. In its basement, there are several stone crosses. Their appearance fully corresponds not only to the images in the Notre Dame de Paris Cathedral, but also to the Orthodox crosses from Russian churches of the 15th century. For example, this cross from the Church of the Resurrection in Rostov, which historians date back to the end of the 15th century. The crosses in the Paul Dupuy Museum are also dated to the 14th–15th centuries. This is indicated on a nearby plaque. However, they are not called Cathar crosses but stone discoidal steles. On one hand, there is no objection to that. They are indeed discoidal steles, made of stone. On the other hand, why not explicitly state that they are Cathar crosses? It is obvious, probably because such dating does not align with the traditional version of Cathar history. In our film, Reformation, the Dissolution of the Empire, we talked about how European historians deliberately distorted the entire world history after the victory of the Reformation Rebellion. The goal of this massive falsification was to completely conceal the true picture of historical events, especially those that took place in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. As a result, the rebels who were true renegades from the old faith were declared good, while those who remained faithful to orthodoxy were labeled as bad, heretics. The fate of the Cathars was terrible and tragic. The Reformation rebellion tore the empire apart. Some regions of Western Europe remained loyal to the imperial idea and resisted like the Cathars until the end. However, the dying empire could not save itself or them. The 500 Cathars who took refuge in the castle of Montségur resisted the traitors to the empire the longest. The Crusaders besieged them for an entire year. Assaults on the castle ended in failure time after time. It was captured only through betrayal. The survivors were given a choice between renouncing their faith or being burned at the stake. Over 200 Cathars refused to renounce. They all perished in the flames on the stakes erected at the foot of the mountain. In 1960, a monument to the fallen Cathars was erected at the site of the burning of the defenders of Montségur Castle. At its base lies a small flat stone on which the words of English philosopher Francis Bacon are engraved. It is an heretic that makes the fire, not she which burns in it. Today, these words, in addition to the philosophical meaning that Bacon put into them, became literal. So, we believe that with the help of Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky, we have managed to find the answer to the question, who are the Cathars?
The Cathars were conquerors who came to Western Europe from the Russia horde in the 13th, early 14th century. They were not heretics. They professed Orthodox Christianity, the unified religion of the entire empire at that time. In the 17th century, during the Reformation revolt, the Cathars remained loyal to their faith, their ideas, and the idea of the great empire. They fought to the bitter end against the rebels of Western Europe.
Unfortunately, the Cathars were not the only or last victims of the Reformation. It is believed that the Reformation process in Western Europe ended in 1648 with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia. However, Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky argue that this is just a formal historical date. In reality, the wars of the Reformation continued until the mid-18th century, not only in Europe but also in Russia. The authors of the new chronology include the wars of the Romanovs with Stepan Razin in the 17th century, and later with Yemelyan Pugachev already in the 18th century among them. In 1667, during the reign of Alexei Mikhailovich, the country was engulfed in the largest rebellion, later called the Razin Rebellion. It is also known as the Peasant War. It is believed that supposedly peasants and Cossacks rebelled against their landlords and the Tsar. The rebellion spread to vast territories of the Russian Empire, lasting for 4 years, but was eventually suppressed by the Romanovs. What do we know today about Stepan Timofeyevich Razin? Virtually no authentic documents have been preserved from the Razin side, which lost this war. It is believed that only 7 or 6 of them survived. But at the same time, historians say that only one can be considered genuine. Although it is highly doubtful and gives the impression of a draft. Moreover, historians acknowledge that this document was not written by Razin himself, but by his associates who were far from his main headquarters on the Volga. Russian historian Viktor Ivanovich Buganov in his work Razin and His Men, referring to a multi-volume academic collection of documents on the Razin Rebellion, wrote that the overwhelming majority of these documents came from the government camp of the Romanovs. From this stems the silencing of the facts, the tendentiousness in their coverage, and even direct lies. What did the rebels want? What were their demands from the supreme rulers in Moscow? Well, it is known that the Razin rebels fought under the banner of a war for the great sovereign against the traitorous boyars in Moscow. Historians explain this seemingly strange slogan by saying that the Razin rebels were very naive and wanted to protect the unfortunate Moscow Tsar, Alexei Mikhailovich, from his own corrupt Moscow boyars. But allegedly, one of the Razin documents contains the following text. In the present year, in 179, October, the 15th day, by the decree of the great sovereign and by his royal charter, we, the great Don army, left the Don to serve him, the great sovereign, so that we, all of us, would not finally perish from them, the traitorous boyars. Let's pay attention to the fact that the name of Alexei Mikhailovich is not mentioned in the document. Historians consider this detail insignificant. Since it is written Great Sovereign, it means that it refers to Tsar Alexei Romanov. However, in their other documents, the Razin rebels express a clearly contemptuous attitude towards the Romanov authorities. They refer to all their actions and documents as thieving, meaning unlawful. And here arises an obvious contradiction. The rebels, for some reason, do not recognize Alexei Mikhailovich Romanov as the legitimate ruler of Russia, but they go to fight for him.
Our reconstruction eliminates this contradiction. We believe that Stepan Timofeyevich Razin was not just a Cossack ataman but a military leader of the great sovereign of all Russia, but not Alexei Romanov, against whom he fought. The thing is, after the time of troubles and the ascent of the Romanovs to power in Moscow, the southern part of Russia, apparently, seceded. And there was a sovereign from an old lineage ruling there, with the capital in Astrakhan. It was the Astrakhan sovereign that Stepan Timofeyevich Razin served. He was his military leader. Presumably, the Astrakhan sovereign of that time was from the Cherkasky princely family. We cannot say for this certain, but there is a lot of data that speaks about it. Which of the Cherkasky princes exactly was the sovereign, we cannot say. The fact is that the history of that time was heavily distorted by the Romanov historians, and it has to be reconstructed literally bit by bit.
The Cherkasky family was one of the old royal lineages of the Russia Horde. They were considered descendants of Egyptian sultans, which is reflected in their family coat of arms. It is known that from 1380 to 1517, Circassian sultans ruled in Egypt. Unfortunately, today the original meaning of the word Cherkasy is almost forgotten. Now scholars place historical Cherkassia or Cherkessia in the North Caucasus, while adding that at the end of the 16th century, this name disappears from historical documents. However, it is well known that in Russia until the 18th century, the term Cherkasy referred to the Dnieper Cossacks. As for the presence of someone from the Cherkasky princes in Razin's troops, there is evidence to support this. Even in the Romanovs' version of history, it is conveyed that there was a certain Alexei Grigorievich Cherkashenin in Razin's army, one of the Cossack atamans referred to as Razin's sworn brother. It is possible that this referred to Prince Grigory Sunchalevich Cherkasky, who shortly before the Razin uprising served as a military leader in Astrakhan but was soon killed on his estate after the Romanovs' victory in 1672. The Romanovs did not easily achieve victory in this war. Razin's campaigns on the Volga were accompanied by mass uprisings of serfs. As it is known, in the Sabornaya Olazhenie of 1649, which is the council code, Tsar Alexei Romanov established indefinite serfdom in Russia. Therefore, it is not surprising that in the recently subjugated regions of the Volga, peasants joined Razin's troops. Following the Russian peasants, large groups of other Volga peoples also rose up. Mari, Chuvash, Mordvins. But in addition to the common people, Romanov troops also switched sides to join Razin. German newspapers of that time wrote, "So many strong troops ended up with Razin that Alexei Mikhailovich was so terrified that he no longer intended to send troops against him." The Romanovs managed to turn the tide of the war with great difficulty. There is evidence that the Romanovs had to supplement their troops with Western European mercenaries. This was because after frequent cases of defection to Razin's side, Russian and Tatar troops were already considered unreliable by the Romanovs. In contrast, the Razin forces had a negative attitude towards foreigners. If any foreign mercenaries were captured, the Cossacks usually killed them. Historians present all these large-scale events merely as the suppression of a peasant revolt. The Romanovs actively introduced this version immediately after their victory. Even special charters, called sovereign exemplars, were produced, in which the official version of the Razin uprising was detailed. Local authorities were ordered to read the charter aloud to all people at the government office more than once. But if a 4-year military confrontation was nothing more than a revolt of the common folk, it means that half the country rebelled against the Romanovs. Or perhaps it was not a revolt at all?
According to our reconstruction, the so-called Razin uprising was not an ordinary peasant revolt but a major war between two emerging states at that time. It is generally believed that in 1613, Mikhail Romanov became the Tsar of all Russia. Most likely, this is incorrect. Initially, the Romanovs controlled only a small part of the former metropolis of the Horde Empire, part of White Russia, and part of the northern Volga, including Novgorod the Great, also known as Yaroslavl. The second Russian state emerged in the south with its capital in Astrakhan. Between these two kingdoms, a large-scale struggle was waged at that time.
This hypothesis is supported by surviving Western European documents as well. For example, Viktor Ivanovich Buganov in his book Razin and His Men, which we have already cited, provides another interesting document. It turns out that the uprising in Russia led by Razin caused a great resonance in Europe, especially in Western Europe. Foreign informants often viewed the events in Russia as a struggle for power, for the throne. Moreover, the Razin uprising was called the Tatar Rebellion. In November 1671, Astrakhan was captured by Romanov forces. This date is considered the end of the war between the Romanov Russia and the troops of Stepan Timofeyevich Razin. However, the circumstances of the defeat of Astrakhan are practically unknown. It is believed that Razin himself was captured in the Don region as a result of betrayal and executed in Moscow. But even in the capital, the Romanovs did not feel safe. Jacob Reutenfels, an eyewitness to Razin's execution, wrote, "To prevent unrest that the Tsar feared, the square where the criminal received his punishment was surrounded by a triple row of the most loyal soldiers, by the Tsar's order. Only foreigners were allowed into the enclosed area, and squads of troops stood at the intersections throughout the city." Why were the Romanovs ultimately able to win the war against Razin, who was supported by a large part of the country's population? Some researchers believe that the Razin rebels catastrophically lacked firearms and gunpowder. At that time, there were very few weapons and gunpowder factories in southern Russia. Allegedly, there are testimonies that due to the shortage of weapons, Razin's men did not accept volunteers who did not have their own guns. Did this become the main reason for Razin's defeat? Most likely not. Finding an answer to this question can only be done by studying it impartially and without looking back at the cries of Romanov historians. It will certainly not be easy to do so. As we mentioned earlier, there are no authentic documents left from Stepan Razin. The Romanovs exerted tremendous efforts to find and destroy every single document from the Razin side. The thoroughness with which they were sought is evidenced by the following fact. During the interrogation, Razin's younger brother Frol claimed that Razin buried a jug with documents on the island of the Don River, in the spill stream under the willow tree. Romanov troops dug up the entire island and sifted through the soil beneath all the willow trees, but they found nothing. Frol was executed only a few years later, probably in an attempt to extract from him accurate information about the documents. But he took that secret to his grave. Perhaps some documents about the Razin War were stored in the Kazan and Astrakhan archives. Unfortunately, these archives have disappeared. This is Encyclopaedia Britannica, a fundamental publication known worldwide. Since its inception in 1768, it has been the most comprehensive collection of information from various fields of knowledge. This work represented the pinnacle of encyclopedic knowledge in the 18th century. In 1771, the Encyclopaedia Britannica recorded some interesting information. In the geography section, there are 5 geographical maps: Europe, Asia, Africa, North America, and South America. These maps are meticulously compiled. The geography section ends with a table listing all the known countries at that time, indicating their areas, capitals, and distances from London. Interestingly, in the territory that, as we believe today, belonged to the Russian Empire, there were several states in the 18th century. Namely, Russia with its capital in St. Petersburg, covering an area of 1,103,485 square miles. Moscow or Great Tartary or Tartaria with its capital in Tabals, which had an area almost 3 times larger than that of Russia, amounting to 3,050,000 square miles. Independent Tartary with its capital in Samarkand, and Chinese Tartary with its capital in Xi'an. So, we can see that in 1771, the largest state was Great Tartary. All other countries were at least half that size. It not only owned lands in Eurasia but also on the North American continent. So where did this enormous state disappear to? Why have historians pretended for almost 250 years that it never existed? When studying the 18th century geographical maps, one understands that during that era, Great Tartary was practically inaccessible to Europeans. It is evident that they had vague notions about certain parts of its territory. The western part of the North American continent is not depicted at all on these maps. European cartographers of that time did not know whether America connected to Siberia or if there was a strait there. Perhaps Europeans were not concerned about this. But why didn't the American government show interest in neighboring lands? After all, historians claim that these lands already belonged to the United States. Everything changed at the end of the 18th century when the tumultuous conquest of Great Tartary's lands began. It happened from two sides simultaneously. For the first time, the forces of the Romanovs entered Siberia, controlled by the Russia Horde, and the Far East. And the forces of the recently formed United States of America, which emerged upon the ruins of the Russia Horde Empire in America, entered the western half of the North American continent, stretching south to California and east to the middle of the continent. After these events, there was no longer a white spot on the new geographical maps with the inscription Terra Incognita covering the northwest of America. And the inscription Great Tartary disappeared from the map of Siberia. But why were these lands conquered in the 18th century?
In the late 18th century, the final decisive battle took place between Western Europe and the Romanov Russia on one side, and the last fragment of the Russia Horde, the Tabal's Siberian American state, on the other. This enormous and large-scale war was then falsely presented in history as a war against peasants and Cossacks under the leadership of Yemelyan Pugachev. Romanov historians, as usual, completely distorted history and presented such a major war as the suppression of a peasant uprising. In reality, based on what we have learned about Russian history, we must completely re-evaluate the events of the late 18th century. It was the last major turning point in world history that solidified the victory of new forces, new power in the world, and essentially marked the beginning of the modern history of the 19th century, which we are all familiar with.
How is the war between the Romanovs and Pugachev presented in traditional history? Just like the rebellion of Stepan Razin, it is impossible to judge the war with Pugachev based on primary sources. Until the end of the Romanovs' rule, the case of Yemelyan Pugachev was an important state secret. When Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin worked on the history of Pugachev, he encountered the fact that the case was sealed. Pushkin wrote that he had brought together in his work everything that the government had published regarding Pugachev, as well as whatever appeared to be reliable in those foreign authors who wrote of him. These materials were sufficient for Pushkin's relatively short work. His history of Pugachev spans only 36 pages. Pushkin was aware that his work was far from complete. He wrote, "The future historian who is allowed to unseal the Pugachev file will find it easy to correct and amplify my work." So, even a well-known figure in the Russian Empire like Alexander Pushkin was unable to familiarize himself with the documents regarding the so-called Pugachev's rebellion. Hiding the originals far away from prying eyes, as usual, the Romanovs fabricated their own history of those events. But this story, like many other fabrications of Romanov historians, contains numerous contradictions. Until now, the forces of Yemelyan Pugachev are still referred to as bands. However, bands usually consist of a specific category of people. It is known that when Pugachev took cities, he was joyfully welcomed by the entire population, both common folk and merchants, and even church hierarchs. As Pushkin wrote, in Penza, the inhabitants came out to meet Pugachev with icons and bread and fell on their knees before him. Moreover, the Ural factories worked for Pugachev and cast cannons for him.
The Romanov version of history claims that the workers of the Ural factories rebelled and joined Pugachev's illegal uprising. However, in reality, it was not the case. Most likely, the Ural factories belonged to Moscow Tartary from the very beginning, whose forces were commanded by Pugachev. Therefore, naturally, they served the army of Yemelyan Pugachev.
It is commonly believed that Pugachev unlawfully proclaimed himself as the Tsar and issued royal manifestos upon entering cities. Romanov historians say that he adopted the name of the late spouse of Empress Catherine the Great, Tsar Peter III, who died in July 1762. But here's what Pushkin writes. On July 27, Pugachev entered Saransk. He was received not only by the common folk, by the clergy and merchants. In Saransk, Archimandrite Alexander received Pugachev with a cross and gospel, and during the prayer service, Her Majesty Ostinia Petrovna was mentioned in the litany. In other words, there are testimonies that the Archimandrite of Saransk called not Catherine the Empress, but a completely different queen.
Today we no longer know the true name of the Tsar of Moscow Tartary who ruled in Tabals, nor the true name of the leader of his forces, so to speak Pugachev. The fact is that the word Pugachev is most likely invented by the Romanov propagandists, derived from the word Pugach or Pugalo, meaning scarecrow. It is similar to how they invented the last name Otrepiev for Tsar Dmitry Ivanovich from the word Otrebier, meaning garbage, lees of society. This is a technique used by experienced propagandists to discredit a historical figure by giving them a poorly sounding name.
In the Romanov version of suppressing the Pugachev rebellion, the victory of the Romanovs came, in general, without much effort. The troops of Catherine the Great easily crushed the disorganized and unruly gangs of Pugachev. But even from this edited version, it is clear that the regular army was sent against some kind of insignificant bands. The renowned historian Yevgeny Petrovich Savelyev wrote in his book, Ancient History of the Cossacks, that besides other forces, 14 Don regiments fought against Pugachev. But despite this resistance, Pugachev made quite successful advances toward Moscow, which horrified Catherine. She wanted to personally lead the troops to save Moscow and Russia, but she was dissuaded from this decision. By that time, the war with Turkey had ended, and Alexander Suvorov had returned from the front, becoming the commander-in-chief of all the forces. In other words, the task of fighting against the disorganized gangs was entrusted to the country's top military leader.
Even in the sanitized Romanov version of history, it is evident that the so-called peasant revolt was opposed by the mobilized regular army. Moreover, Suvorov, the greatest military commander of that time, was called upon, which historians usually conceal. It was a large-scale war, and by no means the suppression of a riot. Huge professional forces were involved from both sides, the army, cavalry, and artillery. If historians had not distorted the true events of that time, these glaring contradictions, visible to the naked eye, would not have arisen.
Another strange fact from the history of the Pugachev's war. Historians report that Pugachev's trial took place in Moscow, in the throne room of the Kremlin Palace. But if Pugachev was really a simple Cossack, an impostor, the leader of some gang, would he have been tried in the famous throne room? It seems inappropriate, not fitting his rank. However, if Pugachev was the embodiment of the Romanovs' main enemy, the Great Tartary, and they were celebrating their victory over it, then the symbolic choice of the Kremlin's throne room becomes completely understandable and even necessary. Regardless of who actually stood before the court under the fabricated nickname Pugachev, It was a trial against the Russia-Horde Empire, which finally ceased to exist to the joy of the Romanovs and their Western European allies. The fact that the Romanovs were not fighting against peasant rebels but against the armies of the Great Tartary is indicated by a fact cited by historians themselves. Only from the late 18th century, that is, after the defeat of Pugachev, did Siberia become a place of exile. For example, only from 1790 were the convicted individuals sent to Tabals. Prior to that, in the Russian Empire the famous Solovki, that is, Solovetsky Islands were used for exile. This means that only after winning the war against Pugachev did the Romanovs gain access to Siberia, which had been closed to them before. And the United States gained access to the western half of the North American continent only after their victory over Pugachev. In the division of these lands, the Romanovs obtained only Alaska, probably because it directly adjoined Siberia. However, in the end, they had to give it to the Americans for only a nominal amount, a paltry sum. In 1775, the Russian government prohibited even mentioning the name of Pugachev. The Stanitsa Zimoveyskaya, where he supposedly was born, was renamed to Potemkinskaya. The river Yaik was renamed Ural, and the Yaik Cossacks began to be called Ural Cossacks. The Volga Cossack host was abolished. The Zaporozhian Sech was liquidated. By the order of Catherine the Great, all the events of this war were consigned to eternal oblivion and deep silence. The false version of history and chronology became the cause of yet another historical mystery. The mystery of the Etruscans' origin. Restoring the true history of this ancient people became a real problem for professional historians. To learn who the Etruscans really were, where they came from to the Apennine Peninsula, and where they disappeared, watch our next film, Etruscans Are Russians.